I remember the taste of ash when I realized I had stopped being human. It mingled with the incense from the cathedral's censers, creating a flavor that should have been sacred, but instead tasted like endings, like the moment between breath and suffocation, like the space where a soul used to live. The bodies were still burning when I knelt before the altar. 143 citizens of Sanctus Meridian, arranged in neat rows across the cathedral floor where they had been made to kneel for their final prayer. 143 voices that had hesitated just a fraction too long when commanded to recite the litany of devotion. 3 seconds. That was all. 3 seconds of uncertainty, of mouths opening but no words emerging, of eyes that sought each other instead of the Emperor's effigy above the chancel. 3 seconds was enough. My flamer had spoken with the voice of righteousness, and now the faithful had been purged. I knelt in my crimson power armor, the ceramite still warm from the promethium ignition, and I felt nothing. That was what made me finally understand. Not the burning, not the screaming that had echoed through the vaulted ceiling before being replaced by the wet crackle of cooking flesh, but the absence. The vast, echoing absence where emotion should have lived. I raised my gauntleted hands before my eyes, studying them in the flickering light of 143 pyres. The armor was beautiful, I knew, crafted by the finest artificers of the ecclesiarchy, blessed by canonesses whose names were carved in the very stones of terror, polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the Emperor's light. But the face that looked back at me from those polished surfaces was a stranger's, smooth, serene, empty of everything except devotion so pure it had burned away every other capacity for feeling. When had that happened? When had the girl who wept over broken birds become the woman who could smell burning children and feel only satisfaction at duty fulfilled? The smoke rose in lazy spirals, carrying particles of ash that drifted down like black snow. They settled on my armor, on the white marble floor, on the golden aquila mounted above the altar. Ash that had been people. Ash that had been mothers and fathers and merchants and scribes and children, young enough that they had not yet learned to recite prayers with the proper speed. Now they were particles, indistinguishable from each other, united in death as they had failed to be united in devotion. I should have felt something, regret, perhaps, or horror at what I had done, or even pride in my service to the Emperor's will. But there was only the nothing, only the recognition that whatever mechanism in the human soul produces mercy or doubt or compassion had been surgically excised from mine so completely that I could not remember what it felt like to possess such weaknesses. Behind me, I heard the footsteps of Canoness Superior Thessalia, her ceremonial robes whispering against the scorched floor as she approached. She stopped beside me, and I could feel her gaze upon the scene we had created together. She had given the order. I had executed it. This was how faith functioned in the Imperium of man. Clean, efficient, merciless. "Well done, Sister Mirael," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar quality of approval that all canonesses seem to cultivate, cold as a knife blade but warm with the fire of righteousness. "Your devotion is exemplary. The Emperor is pleased with your service." I wanted to ask her how she knew, how she could be certain that the corpse god entombed on distant Terra, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, could feel pleasure at all, let alone pleasure at this particular offering of burned citizens who had hesitated to pray correctly. But the words died before they could form. Not from fear, but from the recognition that the question itself was a symptom of doubt, and doubt was the first step toward the repentia cells, toward having everything I was stripped away and replaced with pain and penance and eventual release in suicidal battle. So instead, I said what a sister of battle was supposed to say. "The Emperor protects, Canoness, I am but his instrument." "Indeed," Thessalia replied, and I heard satisfaction in her voice. "You have become what we shaped you to be, perfect in your devotion, untainted by mercy or weakness, a living weapon of the faith." A living weapon. The words echoed in the hollowness where my humanity used to live. That was exactly right. That was exactly what I had become. Not a person anymore, but a mechanism, a tool wrapped in blessed armor and programmed with prayers, aimed at the enemies of mankind, and fired without hesitation or doubt. I looked down at my hands again, watching the ash settle into the joints of my gauntlets. Each particle had been a person once. Each fragment of carbon had been someone's daughter or son, someone's hope for the future, someone who had laughed and loved and dreamed of better days. Now, they were nothing, less than nothing. Fuel for the eternal fire of the Imperium's righteousness, and I had made them so without feeling anything at all. That was when I knew. In that cathedral full of smoke and death, and the sweet rotting smell of burned flesh disguised by incense, surrounded by the evidence of my perfect devotion, I finally understood what the sisterhood had done to me. What it did to all of us who wore the crimson and white, who carried flamers and bolters and sang hymns as we killed. They had not made me holy. They had made me hollow. And in that hollowness, they had poured faith so concentrated and pure that it had burned away everything else that made me human, leaving only this, a woman who could kneel in a cathedral full of corpses she had created and feel nothing except a faint, distant curiosity about when exactly she had stopped being able to cry. I had not always been incapable of tears. Once, long ago, I had been a child who cried over small things, over scraped knees and broken toys, and the particular loneliness that comes on cold nights when sleep refuses to arrive. I had been Ilara then, just Ilara, and tears had come easily because the world had not yet taught me that weeping was a weakness to be excised like a tumor from the soul. The memory surfaced unbidden as I knelt in that cathedral of ash, triggered perhaps by the smell of burning or the way the smoke caught in my throat. I remembered being 8 years old in the lower hives of Sanctus Leor, a shrine world where every street corner held a statue of a saint and every factory wall bore frescoes depicting the Emperor's glory. We lived in Hab Unit 7 Theta 9, a single room with walls the color of old rust and a ceiling so low my father had to stoop when he stood. But it had been home. My mother sang lullabies in a voice like honey poured over gravel. Old songs she had, learned from her grandmother, whose grandmother had learned them during the settlement of Sanctus Leor 3,000 years before. Songs about distant terror and the golden age before the long night, when humanity had walked among the stars without fear. She would sing them while she worked her shift at the textile factory, and again when she returned, her fingers stained purple from the dyes they used to color the vestments for the planetary priesthood. My father carved wooden angels. It was his only art, his only rebellion against the grinding monotony of factory work. He would sit at our small table after his shift at the Promethium refineries, his hands still trembling from the day's labor, and carve tiny figures from scraps of wood he collected. Angels with flowing robes and wings that seemed too delicate to hold any weight. Faces serene with an expression I would not recognize until much later, as the look of souls already departed from the flesh. He gave me one on my 7th birthday. An angel no larger than my thumb, its wings spread wide as if caught in the moment of ascension. I kept it in a small wooden box beside my sleeping mat, and at night I would hold it in my palm and imagine what it would be like to fly above the hive, above the smoke and the crowds and the endless grey sameness of industrial devotion. The factory collapse came on the 3rd day of Martyrdom Week. A support beam in Sector 9 gave way during the evening shift, and 3 levels of the textile manufactory folded in on themselves like a house of cards built by a child who had finally grown bored of the game. The death toll was 842. My mother was among them, crushed beneath machinery that had been deemed acceptable by tech priests who understood that human life was the Imperium's most renewable resource. My father lasted 6 days longer. He went into the ruins with the recovery teams, searching for her body among the twisted metal and broken stone. On the 6th day, a secondary collapse buried him in the same tomb where my mother lay. They never recovered either body. The ecclesiarchy declared them both martyrs to the cause of imperial industry, and their names were added to the wall of remembrance in the local chapel, carved in letters so small I needed to stand on my toes to read them. I was alone then, 8 years old and suddenly an orphan, standing in our HAB unit with nothing but a wooden angel and the fading memory of my mother's lullabies. The Schola Progenium came 3 days after my father's funeral. They arrived in a black transport with the Aquila emblazoned on its sides, and they brought with them Canoness Esther, whose face looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the saints in the street corners. She knelt before me, this woman in robes of crimson and white, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was cold even through the fabric of my mourning shroud. "Child," she said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You have been chosen. The God Emperor has seen your purity of spirit, your capacity for devotion. You will come with us to the Schola, where you will be shaped into an instrument of his will." I did not want to go. I tried to tell her this, but the words came out wrong, tangled with tears and the desperate hope that if I refused strongly enough, she would leave me to whatever future orphans were allowed in the lower hives. But refusal was not an option. The selection had been made. The administratum had filed the necessary forms. I was property of the ecclesiarchy now, raw material to be refined into something useful for the Imperium's endless wars. They gave me 10 minutes to gather my belongings. I took the wooden angel. Nothing else seemed to matter. Not the clothes or the few books of approved scripture, or the threadbare blanket my mother had stitched together from factory scraps. Just the angel, clutched in my palm as they led me to the transport. I looked back once as we pulled away from HAB Unit 7 Theta 9. The door was still open, and in the dim light I could see the small wooden box where I had kept my treasures. Empty now, abandoned like everything else from the life of a girl named Elara, who had cried easily and believed her parents would live forever. The Schola Progenium rose from the middle hive like a cathedral built to house suffering. Its walls were grey stone, unmarked except for scripture carved in high Gothic that proclaimed the virtues of sacrifice and devotion. Inside, the halls echoed with the sound of children's voices raised in prayer, a constant droning hymn that filled every corridor and chamber, leaving no space for silence or private thought. They took the wooden angel from me on the first day. "Attachments are weakness," the mistress of initiates explained as she dropped it into a furnace where such contraband was burned. "You must love nothing but the Emperor. You must desire nothing but service. You must be nothing but faith." I watched it burn. The delicate wings curled and blackened. The serene face melted into ash, and I learned my first lesson in what it meant to become a sister of battle. Everything you were before is fuel for what you must become. Everything you loved is kindling for the fire of devotion. Everything that made you human is a weakness to be purged in the name of a God who sits on a throne of gold and feeds on souls. The years in the Schola passed like a rosary being counted by hands that no longer felt the beads. 4 years of prayers that began before dawn and ended after darkness fell. 4 years of lessons in imperial history that were really lessons in hatred. Carefully curated lists of every Xeno species and heretical cult and traitorous thought that threatened the Emperor's domain. 4 years of learning to hold a laceriful, to march in formation, to recite the litany of faith without stumbling over the archaic high Gothic phrases that meant nothing to a 12-year-old girl from the lower hives. I was 12 when I learned what happened to those who asked questions the scholar did not want answered. 12 when I watched my first purification and understood that the sisterhood did not correct weakness. It erased it, completely and permanently, leaving behind something that wore a human face, but had been hollowed out and refilled with shame and desperate manufactured penance. Her name was Senna. She had arrived at the Schola 2 years after me, a thin girl with dark hair that fell to her shoulders and eyes that still held something like curiosity, like the dangerous belief that the universe might contain answers if only one knew how to ask the right questions. We had become friends in the way that prisoners become friends, bonded by shared suffering and the small rebellions we could manage in the spaces between prayers. She would whisper jokes during the evening meal, irreverent observations about the canonesses that made me choke on my corpse starch rations trying not to laugh. She would share the extra scripture passages she had been assigned as punishment for daydreaming during devotionals, and I would help her memorize them before the morning inspection. I thought she understood the rules. I thought she knew which thoughts were safe to voice and which must be buried so deep that even you forgot they existed. But I was wrong. It happened during theological instruction, in the cold stone classroom where Sister Instructor Magdalene taught us about the nature of faith and the Emperor's divine will. She had been explaining why we must hate the heretic, the mutant, the xenos, why compassion for the impure was itself a form of corruption, why mercy shown to the enemies of mankind was a betrayal of every human soul that had ever lived or would ever be born. Senna raised her hand. Even now, I remember the way my stomach tightened when I saw it, some instinct screaming that whatever question was coming would change everything. Sister Magdalene nodded, permission granted, and Senna spoke in a voice that was genuinely confused, seeking understanding rather than challenging doctrine. "Sister Instructor," she said, "why must we hate to serve him? The Emperor is the master of mankind, yes? So why does serving him require us to hate? Could we not serve through love instead?" The silence that followed was absolute. 40 girls froze in their seats, all of us recognizing the wrongness of what had just been asked, but not yet understanding why it was wrong. Sister Magdalene's face remained perfectly composed, but something in her eyes changed, hardening into the expression I would later recognize as the look of someone who has just identified a cancer that must be cut out before it spreads. "Stand," she commanded, and Senna stood. "You will come with me." I wanted to say something, to call out that Senna did not mean heresy, that she was simply young and confused and had not yet learned which thoughts were safe. But the words died in my throat because I knew, with the terrible clarity that comes from 4 years of scholar conditioning, that intervening would only mark me for purification as well. So I sat silent while my friend was led from the classroom, silent while Sister Magdalene returned alone 20 minutes later and resumed the lesson as if nothing had happened, silent while we filed to evening prayers, and Senna's place in the formation remained empty. They brought her back 3 days later. We were in the chapel of penitence for morning devotionals when the doors opened and the repentia were marched in. That sisterhood within the sisterhood, those who had failed and were being given one final chance at redemption through suffering. They wore nothing but ragged shrouds that barely covered their bodies, their heads shaved to the scalp, their feet bare against the cold stone floor. They carried eviscerators, massive chainswords too heavy for unaugmented humans to wield properly, weapons designed to ensure that when they were finally unleashed in battle, they would die in a frenzy of holy violence that would at least be useful to the Imperium, even if their souls were forever tainted. Senna was among them. I recognized her only by the small birthmark on her left shoulder, a crescent moon shape that she had once told me looked like a smile. Everything else about her had been stripped away. Her dark hair was gone. Her curious eyes were empty, staring straight ahead but seeing nothing, or perhaps seeing only the shame that had been implanted where her personality used to live. Her lips moved constantly, whispering prayers that I could not hear but knew were litanies of penance, endless confessions of unworthiness that she had been trained to recite until belief became indistinguishable from truth. I caught her eye as she passed my place in formation. There was no recognition there, no memory of shared jokes or whispered conversations or the friendship that had made the scholar bearable for both of us. She looked through me as if I were transparent, as if I had never existed, as if the girl she had known named Ilara had already been burned away in the same furnace that had consumed my wooden angel 4 years before. That night, lying on my sleeping mat in the dormitory, I understood what the scholar truly was. It was not a school, it was a factory, and we were the raw materials being processed into something useful for the Imperium's endless wars. Doubt was not an error to be corrected through education or debate. It was a contaminant to be removed through procedures that left the subject technically alive but functionally destroyed, reformatted and reprogrammed into weapons that would gladly die to erase the shame of having questioned doctrine even once. I began to recite my prayers then, there in the darkness, with a precision I had never managed before, every word perfect, every inflection exactly as the sister instructors had taught. Not because I believed, but because I had learned what happened to those who allowed doubt to show on their faces or hesitation to enter their voices. I prayed with the devotion of someone who understands that survival requires perfect performance, that the only way to keep whatever remained of Ilara alive was to bury her so deep beneath layers of manufactured faith that no one would ever know she still existed. The prayers tasted like ash in my mouth, but I spoke them anyway, and I would continue speaking them for years to come, until the girl who remembered a friend named Senna was just another thing I had burned in the furnace of becoming. The prayers that had begun as survival became routine, and routine became ritual, and ritual became something deeper and more dangerous than mere performance. 6 years passed in the grey halls of the Schola Progenium, 6 years during which Ilara was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into Sister Mirael of the Order of the Sacred Rose. The transformation was so gradual that I did not notice it happening until it was already complete, like a poison administered in doses too small to detect, until the body has absorbed enough to ensure death is inevitable. The training escalated in my 16th year. The sister instructors explained that we had moved beyond basic conditioning into what they called sanctification, the process by which ordinary flesh was elevated into vessels worthy of housing divine purpose. What they did not explain was that sanctification meant the methodical destruction of everything that made us human, replaced with reflexes and obsessions carefully engineered to produce perfect soldiers of faith. Sleep became a luxury denied. We were kept awake for days at a time, our bodies sustained by stimulant injections, while our minds were flooded with hypno-indoctrination recordings. I would stand in formation with my eyes propped open by metal clamps, forced to watch vid feeds of saints dying in glorious martyrdom, while voices whispered in high Gothic about duty and sacrifice and the ecstasy of serving the Emperor with your final breath. When they finally let us collapse onto our mats, the dreams that came were not dreams at all, but continuations of the indoctrination, prayers that played on endless loops inside my skull until I could no longer tell the difference between sleeping and waking. They taught us pain conditioning in the chamber of mortification, a windowless room deep beneath the Schola, where the stone walls were scorched black from centuries of use. We would kneel on floors covered in broken glass while reciting litanies, or hold our hands over candle flames until the smell of burning flesh became as familiar as incense. The sister instructors explained that we must learn to embrace suffering, to understand that pain was not the enemy, but a gift from the Emperor, a tool for focusing the mind and purifying the soul. They were right, in a way. After months of conditioning, pain stopped being something I feared and became simply another sensation, neither good nor bad, just data to be processed and ignored. But the weapons training was where the real transformation began, where the conditioning stopped being about endurance and started being about pleasure. The first time I held a bolter, I felt nothing special. It was heavy, awkward in my unaugmented arms, the recoil bruising my shoulder when I fired at the practice targets. But they gave us drugs before each training session, sacred compounds brewed by the Scholars Medici staff, from formulas passed down through millennia of ecclesiarchy tradition. Stimulants to heighten awareness, suppressants to eliminate fear, and other things, chemicals with names I did not know, that rewired the neural pathways connecting action to emotion. After 3 months of drugged weapons practice, I began to associate the weight of the bolter with satisfaction. The recoil became pleasant, a rhythmic pounding that felt like my heartbeat synchronized with the Emperor's will. When I hit the targets, a burst of joy flooded through me, pure and uncomplicated, dopamine released by chemical triggers that bypassed conscious thought and taught my brain that violence was reward. The flamer was worse, or better, depending on how you measured such things. The first time I ignited it during training, feeling the heat bloom across my armor as promethium sprayed from the nozzle and transformed the practice dummies into pillars of fire. Something inside me that had been tightly controlled simply let go. The smell of burning synthetics should have been acrid and unpleasant. Instead, it smelled like comfort, like home, like the feeling I had once associated with my mother's lullabies, a deep contentment that told me this was where I belonged. I began to crave it. Between training sessions, I would find excuses to visit the armory just to smell the promethium storage tanks. I would volunteer for extra flamer practice, pushing my body past exhaustion because the alternative was going without that particular satisfaction for even one more day. The sister instructors noticed and approved, marking my devotion to training as exemplary, never acknowledging that what they had created was not devotion, but addiction. The Chainsword lessons taught me about music, the grinding roar of the blade's teeth against armor plate, the wet tearing sound when it bit into synthetic flesh, the way the vibrations traveled up my arms and resonated in my chest cavity. They were notes in a symphony that played only during combat training, and I learned to anticipate each sound with the eagerness of someone waiting for their favorite passage in a beloved piece of music. When we practiced on servitor dummies programmed to scream, their voices blended with the Chainsword's roar to create harmonies that made my pulse quicken with something that felt disturbingly close to joy. I noticed these changes in myself. Some part of me that was still Ilara, still the girl who had cried over broken birds and treasured wooden angels, watched in horror as Sister Mirael learned to smile at violence and find pleasure in destruction. But that part grew quieter with each passing month, its protests drowned out by the constant prayers and the drugs and the neural conditioning that rewarded cruelty with cascades of artificial happiness. One night, after a particularly intense training session where we had learned to use flamers in close-quarters combat, I caught my reflection in the polished steel of a corridor wall. My face was flushed with exertion, my breathing heavy, and there was blood on my lips where I had bitten through them in concentration. But what stopped me, what made my hands go cold despite the warmth still radiating from my training armor, was the smile. I was smiling. A wide, genuine expression of contentment that I did not remember making, that had appeared on my face without my permission or awareness. I looked like someone who had just experienced something wonderful, something worth savoring. And I had. The training session had been glorious, the flames beautiful, the destruction of the practice targets deeply, profoundly satisfying in ways I could not articulate but felt in every nerve ending. The alarm I felt at seeing that smile lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it faded, swept away by exhaustion and the chemical aftermath of the training drugs still coursing through my system. I turned away from my reflection and walked toward the dormitory, already thinking about tomorrow's session, already anticipating the weight of the flamer in my hands and the smell of promethium and the perfect, uncomplicated pleasure of watching things burn. Ilara was dying, Sister Mirael was being born, and the midwife at that birth was violence, carefully administered until it became not just tolerable, but necessary. Not just necessary, but beloved. The death of Ilara was complete by the time they deployed me to Hive Tertius on the world of Vadus Prime. I was 19 years old and freshly ordained as Sister Mirael of the Order of the Sacred Rose, my armor blessed by a cardinal whose name I have since forgotten, my weapons sanctified with oils that smelled of myrrh and machine lubricant. The mission briefing was straightforward. A Genestealer cult had taken root in the industrial sectors, spreading its Xenos taint through the population like a plague. We were to purge the infected and cauterize the wound before it could spread to the upper hives. I felt excitement during the drop, pure, uncomplicated anticipation of the violence to come. My training had prepared me perfectly. I knew my weapons. I knew my prayers. I knew that what we were about to do was righteous and necessary, that mercy shown to the tainted was itself a form of corruption. The Canoness Superior had explained this during our final briefing, her voice carrying absolute certainty. You are the Emperor's flame, sisters. Burn away the impure and do so without hesitation or doubt. The cult had fortified Sector 7 Gamma, turning residential blocks into a labyrinth of barricades and ambush points. We advanced in formation, our powered armor making us invulnerable to the crude weapons the cultists wielded. They fought with the desperation of those who knew death was inevitable, but desperation meant nothing against faith, backed by ceramite and blessed promethium. I used my flamer for the first time in actual combat, and it was glorious. Everything the training had promised, everything the conditioning had prepared me for, crystallized in those moments of purging flame. The cultists burned beautifully, their twisted bodies silhouetted against the fire as they screamed their final prayers to the alien gods they had foolishly embraced. I felt the satisfaction I had been taught to feel, the righteous pleasure of serving the Emperor's will through destruction. We cleared building after building, room after room, burning out the infection with methodical efficiency. My sisters sang hymns as we worked, our voices echoing through the hab blocks, prayers of cleansing that competed with the screams of the dying. I sang with them, my voice strong and clear, no hesitation in the words even as I reduced entire families to ash. It was in the third hour of the purge that I found them. A woman and her child, hiding in a storage closet behind false paneling that our Auspex scanners had detected. The woman was perhaps 30, her face pale with terror, her arms wrapped around a girl who could not have been older than 6. Both of them bore the markers of Xeno's taint. The slightly elongated skulls, the peculiar violet tint to their eyes, the extra joint visible in their fingers when the woman raised her hands in supplication. "Please," she begged, and her voice was so human that for a moment I forgot she was not. "Please, we did not choose this. The cult came to us. We were infected against our will. We are still faithful. We still pray to the Emperor. Please." The child stared at me with those violet eyes, too large for her face, too knowing for her age. She did not speak. She only watched, waiting to see what judgment I would render. what mercy or damnation I would deliver with my flamer. I should have burned them immediately. My training demanded it. The conditioning that had been beaten into my neural pathways should have made the action automatic, reflexive, no different from pulling my hand away from a hot surface. But something fractured. Some hairline crack in the edifice of Sister Mirael opened just wide enough for Ilara to whisper through. They were a mother and child. Like I had once been a child with a mother who sang lullabies. The woman's eyes held the same desperate love I remembered seeing in my mother's face on the mornings before factory shifts. That determination to protect what was precious, even when the universe offered no protection at all. My flamer hesitated. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, during which my finger remained on the trigger but did not press, during which I stared at the pleading woman and the silent child, and felt something I had not felt in years. Doubt. Sister Mirael, Canoness Superior. The Thessalia's voice cut through my paralysis like a blade through flesh. She stood behind me, her own bolter trained on the woman and child with unwavering certainty. Complete your duty. The command snapped me back into training. I pulled the trigger. The promethium roared from the nozzle, and the closet became an inferno. The woman's scream lasted perhaps 5 seconds before her lungs were seared beyond function. The child made no sound at all. I watched her face disappear into the flames, those violet eyes closing for the final time, and felt nothing except the distant recognition that I should be feeling something. But Canoness Thessalia had seen. She had witnessed those 4 seconds of hesitation, had recognized the symptom of a disease that required immediate treatment before it could spread and infect my soul beyond recovery. After the purge was complete, after we had reduced Sector 7 Gamma to ash and rubble and declared it cleansed of Xenos taint, I was summoned to the command chapel. The canoness did not accuse me of heresy. She did not threaten punishment or speak of failure. Instead, she explained, with the patience of a physician diagnosing a treatable condition, that I required correction. The process took 3 days in a chamber beneath the chapel, strapped to a throne identical to the ones I had trained in, but modified with additional equipment. Neural stimulators attached to my skull. Drugs pumped directly into my bloodstream. Vid screens that played recordings of saints in their final moments, choosing death over mercy, choosing faith over compassion, demonstrating again and again that doubt was the enemy and hesitation was death. They made me watch my own hesitation, recorded by my armor's internal sensors, played back on infinite loop. The woman's face, the child's eyes, my finger frozen on the trigger. 4 seconds that stretched into eternity as I watched myself fail. And with each viewing, the drugs would spike, the neural stimulators would fire, and my brain would associate that moment of hesitation with pain so profound that it became its own kind of fire, burning away the weakness that had allowed Ilara to surface even briefly. By the 3rd day, I could watch the recording without feeling anything except disgust at my own failure. The woman and child were no longer individuals worthy of even momentary consideration. They were Xenos tainted meat that I had been correct to burn, my only error being the delay before I did so. When they released me from the correction throne, Canoness Thessalia placed her hand on my shoulder. "You are whole again, Sister Mirael. The weakness has been purged. You will not hesitate again." She was right. I never did. In the years that followed, I would burn thousands more, and not once would my finger pause on the trigger. Not once would I see the faces of those I killed as anything more than targets requiring elimination. But somewhere, buried beneath the conditioning and the drugs and the endless prayers, a part of me that was still Ilara screamed. She screamed for the woman and child. She screamed for Senna. She screamed for the girl who had treasured wooden angels. And she would continue screaming in that soundproof cell deep inside my mind, unheard and unacknowledged, for every moment of every day until the cathedral filled with ash, and I finally understood what I had become. The correction held for 7 years. 7 years during which I served without hesitation or doubt, burning heretics and Xenos across a dozen worlds, my record of service so exemplary that Canoness Thessalia cited me as an example of proper devotion during instruction sessions with younger sisters. I had become exactly what the scholar designed me to be, a weapon wrapped in crimson armor, aimed at the Imperium's enemies and fired without conscience or mercy. I thought I understood what the sisterhood was. I thought the correction chamber had revealed all the darkness at the heart of our order, that there were no deeper horrors to uncover. I was wrong. The assignment came during our deployment to Convent Sanctorum on the shrine world of Ophelia 7, one of the great fortress monasteries where the Order's militant maintained their strength between crusades. We had returned from the purge of a chaos cult on a nearby world, and while my sisters rested and received new assignments, I was summoned by the prioress and given escort duty to the convent's deepest levels. The Repentia require supervision during their feeding, the prioress explained, her aged face expressionless. You will accompany Sister Attendant Morgana to ensure order is maintained. Consider it an honor to witness the fate of those who failed in devotion, but were granted opportunity for redemption. I had seen Repentia before, of course. The shaven-headed penitents who marched into battle wearing nothing but rags and shame, wielding eviscerators too massive for their frames, seeking death with such desperate enthusiasm that it bordered on obscene. I had fought alongside them during the Vardus Prime campaign, watched them throw themselves at the enemy with suicidal abandon, their screams mixing prayer and agony in equal measure. They disturbed me in ways I could not articulate, but I had accepted them as another tool in the Imperium's arsenal, another consequence of the Sisterhood's unforgiving standards. But I had never been to the deepest levels, never descended past the chapels and dormitories and training halls into the foundations of the convent, where the architecture grew older and the walls bore scorch marks from fires that had burned centuries before my birth. Sister Attendant Morgana led me down through spiral staircases that seemed to have no end, past doors sealed with locks that required 3 separate keys, and prayers spoken in tongues I did not recognize. The smell reached us before we arrived. Unwashed bodies and chemical preservatives and something else underneath. A sweet rotting stench that reminded me of the battlefield dead left too long in the sun. Morgana did not react to it, her breathing steady behind her rebreather mask as we approached the final door. "Steel yourself, Sister Mirael," she said, her voice muffled. "What you are about to witness is the Emperor's mercy expressed through suffering. Remember that these creatures were once our sisters, and their current state is both punishment and opportunity for redemption." She opened the door. The chamber beyond was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness 30 meters above. Dozens of cages lined the walls, each one containing something that had once been human but had been rebuilt into a grotesque parody of life. Arco-flagellants, I realized with mounting horror. The Repentia who had failed even at penance, who had survived their suicidal charges and been judged still unworthy of death's release. The Ecclesiarchy's final solution for the faithless. Transformation into lobotomized weapons of flesh and machinery. They had been surgically modified in ways that made my stomach clench, despite years of conditioning. Limbs replaced with piston-driven appendages. Skulls split open and refitted with chemical injector ports. Torsos augmented with stimulant reservoirs and pain amplifiers. Their faces, where faces still existed, were slack with drool and incomprehension. Eyes vacant except when the stimulants flooded their systems and transformed them into shrieking engines of violence. "They are fed twice daily," Morgana explained, moving among the cages with practiced efficiency. Nutrient paste delivered through feeding tubes. The process requires 2 attendants in case the stimulants trigger prematurely, and they must be subdued. I followed her numbly, trying not to look at the creatures in the cages, but unable to stop myself. Each one had been a sister once. Each one had worn armor and carried weapons and recited the same prayers I recited. And through failure or doubt or simply bad fortune in battle, they had been reduced to this: meat and machinery, barely alive, kept functional only so they could be unleashed one final time against the Imperium's enemies. We were halfway through the feeding when I saw her. The cage was in the corner, its occupant smaller than the others, her augmentations less extensive but no less horrible. Her head had been shaved and scarred by surgery, ports drilled directly into her skull for the chemical injectors that kept her docile between deployments. Her limbs had been replaced with crude mechanical appendages, pistons and cables barely covered by synthetic skin. But there was a birthmark on her left shoulder, crescent-shaped, that I had seen once before during morning prayers 7 years ago. Senna, my childhood friend. The girl who had asked why we must hate to serve the Emperor. The repentia I had seen with empty eyes, whispering prayers of penance. She had not died in glorious battle as I had assumed. She had survived, and survival had earned her this: transformation into an arco-flagellant, her mind chemically destroyed, her body rebuilt as a weapon to be used and discarded. I moved closer to her cage without thinking. Her eyes tracked me, but there was no recognition in them, no awareness of anything beyond the base animal needs that the lobotomy had reduced her to. Drool leaked from the corner of her mouth, her augmented hands clenched and unclenched rhythmically, servo motors whirring. When Morgana approached with the feeding tube, Senna made a sound, half growl and half moan, that might have been hunger or pain or simply the noise a broken machine makes when its gears grind against each other. "This one is scheduled for deployment next week," Morgana said, consulting her data slate. "She has survived remarkably long. Most arco-flagellants last only 2 or 3 battles before system failure or enemy fire claims them. This one has endured 7 deployments. Quite exceptional, really. 7 deployments. 7 times Senna had been stimulated into berserk fury and unleashed upon the enemy. 7 times she had survived when death would have been mercy, and she would be deployed again and again, until finally her augmented body failed or some merciful enemy reduced her to component parts. This was what the Sisterhood did to those who questioned. Not correction, not redemption, annihilation. Complete and total destruction of everything that made a person human, leaving behind a weapon that wore human skin but contained nothing except manufactured rage and chemical compulsion. I looked around the chamber at the dozens of cages, at the dozens of former sisters who had all made some mistake or harbored some doubt or simply failed to die quickly enough in battle. This was the machinery behind the faith. This was the truth they did not teach in the Schola. The Sisterhood did not elevate. It consumed. It took young girls and fed them into a system that stripped away humanity piece by piece, until nothing remained except obedience. And when obedience faltered, it took even that, leaving behind these things that shrieked and killed on command but could not remember their own names. I was looking at my future, at what awaited every sister who allowed even a moment's doubt to show. Senna had asked one question, one simple, innocent question born of confusion rather than heresy, and for that, she had been reduced to this: a drooling weapon in a cage, waiting to be deployed and destroyed. The screaming that Ilara had been doing in the soundproof cell of my mind suddenly grew louder, loud enough that for the first time in 7 years, I could hear it clearly. And in that moment, I finally understood what I had become and what awaited me if I ever faltered. The Emperor protects, we told ourselves. But from this, there was no protection at all. I left the Repentia chambers with the smell of chemical preservatives still clinging to my armor, and I knew that everything had changed, even though nothing would change at all. The revelation did not set me free. It simply made me aware of my chains, and awareness without the possibility of escape is its own form of damnation. There was no leaving the sisterhood. I understood this with the same cold clarity that I understood the purpose of the arco-flagellants. Desertion meant execution if caught quickly, or transformation into something worse than Senna if caught slowly. The Imperium did not waste resources. A sister who fled was simply a sister who had revealed her weakness, and weakness could be repurposed, augmented, lobotomized, and deployed until her body finally failed and granted her the death she should have accepted willingly. So I continued. I attended prayers at dawn and dusk. I maintained my armor with the ritual oils. I trained with my weapons until muscle memory became indistinguishable from devotion. And I deployed on mission after mission, burning and killing with the same mechanical efficiency I had demonstrated for 7 years. Except now, I was conscious of every trigger pull, every ignition of promethium, every life I ended in the Emperor's name. We returned to Vadus Prime 6 months after my visit to the Repentia chambers. A new cult had emerged in the territories we had cleansed, proof that purging was never complete, that the Imperium's solution to corruption was not cure, but amputation followed by cauterization, followed by more amputation when the infection inevitably returned. I walked through streets I had burned before, past buildings I had reduced to ash, and I felt nothing except the recognition that I would feel nothing. A city of 3 million souls stood in our path. Intelligence reported that perhaps 30% had been corrupted by the cult's preaching, their faith in the Emperor compromised by promises of a better future under alien gods. The Canonist Superior declared the entire city lost. 30% corruption meant 100% contamination from the ecclesiarchy's perspective. We would burn it all and let the Emperor sort the faithful from the damned. I used my flamer for 6 hours straight during the purge. The fuel tanks on my armor ran dry twice and had to be replaced by servitors while I stood in streets ankle-deep in ash that had been people. I watched families burn in their homes. I watched children run with their clothes on fire until they collapsed. I watched old men and women who had probably never questioned the Imperial Creed in their entire lives die screaming, because they happened to live in a city where 3 out of every 10 citizens had been judged impure. And I felt nothing. The conditioning held. The neural pathways that associated violence with satisfaction still functioned perfectly. When I returned to our temporary convent and cleaned the soot from my armor, my hands were steady. When I knelt for evening prayers, my voice was clear and strong. No hesitation in the litanies of devotion. When I lay on my sleeping mat that night, I fell into dreamless sleep within minutes. The absence of feeling was the horror, not guilt or shame or even the manufactured pleasure the conditioning had taught me to associate with killing. Just nothing. A vast emptiness where emotion should have lived, filled instead with prayers and doctrine and the reflexive obedience that the scholar had beaten into me so thoroughly that it functioned even when I consciously recognized it as programming. I began to understand what the sisterhood truly was in those months of renewed consciousness. We were not holy warriors serving the Emperor's will. We were victims, selected young when our minds were still malleable, subjected to conditioning so thorough that it rewrote the fundamental architecture of our psyches, then deployed as weapons against enemies who were often victims themselves, caught in systems they did not create and could not escape. The Imperium needed us to be weapons. It needed soldiers who would burn cities without hesitation, who would execute the unfaithful without mercy, who would stand vigil over mass graves and see only duty fulfilled rather than mountains of corpses that had once been human beings with names and hopes and dreams of better days. And so it took orphaned girls whose capacity for questioning had not yet solidified and fed them into the machinery of the schola until they emerged as Sister Mirael, perfect in devotion because everything else had been surgically removed. I was a tool. Flamers do not mourn the things they burn. Bolters do not regret the targets they destroy. Chainswords do not weep over the flesh they tear. I was ceramite and conditioning, prayers and programming, a human-shaped weapon aimed at the Imperium's enemies and fired without conscience because conscience was a weakness that had been corrected years ago in chambers designed specifically for that purpose. One night, after a mission where we had executed 200 citizens for the crime of insufficient enthusiasm during mandatory prayer services, I stood alone in my cell and tried to remember my mother's face. The woman who had sung lullabies in a voice like honey over gravel. The woman who had died in a factory collapse on a world so far away and so long ago that it might as well have been a story someone else had told me about someone else's life. I could not remember. The face would not come. I remembered that she had existed, remembered the fact of her like I remembered the date of the Emperor's ascension or the name of the sector we were deployed to, but the actual image, the specific features that had made her unique among all the billions of mothers who had lived and died in service to the Imperium, were gone, erased by years of conditioning and correction and the systematic destruction of everything I had been before the scholar claimed me. I looked at my reflection in the polished surface of my armor, the crimson ceramite catching the light of the candles that burned perpetually in every sister's cell. The face that looked back was Sister Mirael's face, beautiful in the way that all sisters were beautiful, perfect bone structure maintained by the augmentations they had installed during my final year of training. But I did not recognize it as mine. It was the face of someone who had been built from pieces of Elara, reassembled according to specifications determined by canonesses and tech priests, and the ancient doctrines of an ecclesiarchy that had been refining its soldier production methods for 10,000 years. 26 years old, and I could not remember my mother's face, could not recall the sound of my father's laughter, or the feel of a wooden angel held in my palm. Those memories had been fuel, burned away to power the transformation from girl to weapon, from Elara to Mirael, from human being to tool designed for killing in the Emperor's name. The candles burned. My reflection stared back with eyes that held no tears, because weeping was a weakness that had been corrected. And somewhere in the depths of the convent, Senna drooled in her cage, waiting for the stimulants that would transform her into a shrieking engine of violence one more time, before her augmented body finally failed. This was what we were. This was what we had always been. And there was no escape except death or worse, and I was too well trained to choose either. The order came 3 weeks after I stood in my cell and failed to remember my mother's face. A penitent crusade to reclaim the shrine world of sanctified mourning, lost to chaos incursions 6 months prior, when the planetary governor opened the gates to forces he did not understand and could not control. Intelligence reported that the world's cathedrals had been transformed into temples of the dark gods, that its populations had been corrupted or slaughtered, that the very stones of its holy places wept blood and whispered names that should never be spoken. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew it. The briefing did not hide the truth. 200 sisters of battle against a corrupted world defended by traitor Astartes and demonic entities that existed half in reality and half in the nightmare realm of the warp. Our objective was not victory but martyrdom, not reclamation but symbolic defiance. We would die, but our deaths would be recorded and sanctified and used to inspire the next generation of girls being processed through the Schola Progenium. the sisters received the news with joy. Genuine, uncomplicated joy at the prospect of dying in glorious service to the Emperor. They sang hymns of thanksgiving during the voyage, their voices echoing through the transport ship's corridors, prayers of gratitude for being chosen to become martyrs. I sang with them, my voice as strong and clear as any, because that was what Sister Mirael did. But inside, in the soundproof cell where Ilara still screamed, I understood exactly what we were marching toward and why. The Imperium had not created the sisterhood to produce heroes. It had created us to produce martyrs. Girls taken young when their minds could still be shaped, orphaned so they had nothing to return to, conditioned until devotion became indistinguishable from programming, trained to perfection, and then deployed on missions designed to kill them in ways that could be recorded and transformed into propaganda. We were a sacrifice engine, input, orphaned daughters with capacity for faith. Process: 10 years of conditioning, correction, and training. Output: martyrs whose deaths inspired the next batch of inputs to willingly enter the machine. The cycle was eternal, efficient, and by the Imperium standards, completely successful. For 10,000 years, the sisterhood had been converting girls into ash and legend, and the supply had never run dry because orphans were the Imperium's most renewable resource. The drop to sanctified morning's surface was contested. The traitors had orbital defenses, ancient weapon platforms they had corrupted and turned against the Imperium that had built them. Our landing craft took fire during descent, and I watched through the viewport as 3 other craft exploded in blooms of fire that briefly outshone the system's sun. 30 sisters dead before we even touched ground. Their names would be added to the rolls of martyrs, their deaths counted as victories because they had died faithful. We survived the landing, 170 sisters in crimson armor, marching in formation through a landscape that had been transformed by 6 months of chaos corruption. The very ground seemed to breathe beneath our feet, pulsing with a rhythm that suggested something vast and terrible sleeping just below the surface. The sky was the color of infected wounds, purple and yellow and red mixing together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air tasted of copper and rot, and something sweet that made my augmented metabolism spike warnings about toxins and pathogens. The first cathedral stood 3 kilometers from our landing site, its spires still visible despite the mutations that had twisted them into shapes that resembled grasping claws or screaming mouths, depending on the angle of approach. We advanced toward it singing the hymn of righteous fury, our voices steady despite the wrongness that pressed against us from every direction. I marched in the 3rd rank, my flamer held ready, and I looked at the sisters around me. Sister Helena, 19 years old, taken from the Schola just last year. Sister Morgana, veteran of 40 campaigns, her armor bearing scars from battles on worlds I had never seen. Sister Catherine, who had once whispered to me during a long deployment that she still dreamed of her mother sometimes, though she knew such attachments were weakness. All of them marching towards certain death with expressions of serene devotion. All of them already dead, just waiting for the universe to catch up with what the Imperium had decided weeks ago when it planned this mission. We were ghosts dressed in crimson armor, singing hymns as we walked through ruins that had once been holy, but now served as monuments to humanity's endless capacity for corruption and betrayal. Each step took us deeper into the corrupted zone, deeper into the trap that had been set for us, and we went willingly because we had been programmed to do exactly this. The design of it was perfect in its cruelty. The Schola took us young and made us love the Imperium more than life. The conditioning made us crave battle and associate death in service with transcendent purpose. The correction chambers ensured that doubt or hesitation could not take root and grow into refusal. And then, when we had been perfected, when every weakness had been burned away and only faith remained. They sent us to die in battles that served no strategic purpose, but generated the propaganda needed to justify taking the next generation of orphaned girls and feeding them into the same machine. I could not rage against it. Rage required emotion, and emotion had been corrected out of me. I could only see it with perfect clarity, understand it completely, and continue marching because there was no alternative, no escape, no path that did not lead to death or something worse than death. The traitors opened fire when we reached the cathedral's outer walls. Sisters fell around me, bolter rounds punching through blessed ceramite, their blood spraying across stone that had absorbed the blood of faithful worshippers for 1,000 years before corruption came. I returned fire with my flamer, watched heretics burn, and felt nothing except the recognition that soon I would be burning too, and my death would be recorded as glorious martyrdom, and some girl in some schola on some distant world would hear my story and be inspired to become the next Sister Mireille. The sacrifice engine continued its eternal work, and we, its willing fuel, marched singing into the fire that would consume us and transform our ashes into legend. The cathedral doors were already broken when we reached them, torn from their hinges by something with strength beyond human capacity. We advanced into darkness, lit by fires that burned in colors no natural flame should produce, following tactical doctrine that had been beaten into us until it became reflex. Sister Helena died in the entrance hall, her head removed by a chainsword wielded by a traitor Astartes whose armor bore symbols I had been trained to recognize but not speak aloud. She made no sound. One moment she was singing the hymn with us, the next she was falling, her body continuing forward for 2 steps before it understood it was dead. The glory they had promised us did not materialize. There was no transcendent beauty in the violence, no sense of divine purpose in the killing. Just blood and screaming, and the wet sounds of ceramite armor being penetrated by weapons designed to kill things much harder to kill than human beings wrapped in blessed metal. We fought room by room, chamber by chamber, and the sisters fell like wheat before a harvester. Sister Morgana took a bolt round to the chest that detonated inside her armor, painting the corrupted walls with her internal organs. Sister Catherine's flamer exploded when a traitor's shot ruptured the fuel tanks, immolating her instantly in the promethium she had carried to purge the faithless. Sister Agatha, Sister Teresa, Sister Louisa, names I had prayed beside for years, voices I had harmonized with during evening devotionals, faces I had seen reflected in armor during morning preparations. All of them gone, reduced to component parts scattered across a cathedral that had stopped being holy long before we arrived. I fought because I had been programmed to fight. My bolter spoke with mechanical precision, each shot placed exactly where training dictated. My flamer roared when enemies clustered too close, burning traitors and heretics with the same efficiency I had demonstrated on 100 worlds. But there was no faith driving me forward, no belief that the Emperor watched or cared or would remember my service. Just reflexes, conditioning, the accumulated weight of 10 years of training executing itself through my body while my consciousness observed from a distance. The traitors pushed us back, step by step, until only 30 of us remained, then 20, then 10. We retreated into the cathedral's central nave, a vast chamber where the altar had been desecrated with symbols that made my augmented vision blur and distort. The stained glass windows had been shattered, their colored fragments crunching beneath our boots as we formed a final defensive circle. 5 sisters, then 3, then only me, standing alone among the bodies of women who had believed until their final breath that dying here meant something, that their sacrifice would be recorded and sanctified and transformed into inspiration for the next generation of victims being processed through the Schola's machinery. the enemy pulled back, not from fear or respect, but because they had won and wanted to savor the moment, to watch the last sister fall and know that another Imperial strike force had been reduced to corpses and broken faith. I could hear them outside the chamber, laughing with voices that should have been human, but carried harmonics that suggested something worse wearing human vocal cords. I stood in the silence they granted me, surrounded by the dead, and I lifted my flamer one final time. The fuel indicator showed 30% remaining, enough for one more purging. One more burst of promethium to burn away the impure and demonstrate my devotion to a god who had been dead for 10,000 years, sustained only by the daily sacrifice of souls fed into the Golden Throne's machinery. A shard of stained glass caught my eye, a fragment larger than the others, its surface still smooth enough to cast reflections. I saw myself there, a woman in crimson power armor, flamer held ready, face obscured by my helmet's visor. I could have been anyone. Sister Helena, who had died in the entrance hall. Sister Catherine, who had burned alive. Sister Morgana with her 40 campaigns. We all looked the same in the armor, all of us interchangeable parts in the Imperium's sacrifice engine, processed through the Schola and deployed until death claimed us and our names were added to rolls that no one would ever read. Every sister who had come before me had stood in a place like this. Every sister who would come after would stand here too, assuming the Imperium lasted long enough to process the next batch of orphaned daughters. We were all the same. All of us taken young, broken, rebuilt, and deployed to die in battles that served propaganda purposes rather than strategic objectives. All of us forgotten the moment our hearts stopped beating, our deaths reduced to statistics, and our sacrifices transformed into stories told to children who did not yet understand they were looking at their own futures. I understood in that moment of perfect clarity that there was only one choice that was truly mine, one act that the conditioning had not accounted for, one decision that Sister Mirael had not been programmed to make. The Imperium had spent 10 years teaching me how to die for the Emperor. They had never considered that I might choose to die for myself. I turned the flamer inward, pressed the nozzle against my chest where the armor joints were weakest, and I pulled the trigger. The promethium ignited with a roar that filled the cathedral. I felt heat, real and immediate, cutting through the conditioning and the correction and the endless layers of manufactured devotion. Pain bloomed across my chest, spreading through my body faster than my augmented physiology could suppress it. The flames consumed my armor, found my flesh beneath, and began the work of reducing Sister Mirael to ash and carbon. And for the first time in 7 years, since the correction chamber had burned the hesitation out of me, I felt something real. Not the manufactured satisfaction of following programming, not the hollow contentment of duty fulfilled, but genuine sensation, pure and uncomplicated, the recognition that this pain was mine. This death was chosen. This ending belonged to me, and not to the Imperium that had tried to claim every other moment of my existence. I fell among my sisters, my armor scorched black, my body burning. The flames reflected in 100 shattered pieces of stained glass, creating a corona of light that briefly outshone the corruption surrounding me. And as consciousness faded, as the fire consumed everything that remained of both Ilara and Mirael, I understood that this was the only victory I would ever know. Not glory, not martyrdom, just the simple, terrible freedom of choosing my own ending. The flames died eventually, as flames always do. The recovery teams arrived 3 weeks later, after orbital bombardment had reduced the corrupted portions of sanctified morning to radioactive glass, and the Inquisition had declared the world suitable for re-sanctification. They found the bodies in the cathedral's central nave, sisters of battle arranged in a rough circle around a central figure whose armor had been burned black. whose body had been consumed by fire hot enough to melt ceramite. I am Scribe Adept Cornelius of the Ecclesiarchy's Department of Martyrological Records, and it is my duty to transform these deaths into something useful for the Imperium. The raw facts are insufficient. Citizens do not need to know that 200 sisters deployed on a mission everyone understood was suicide, that they died in senseless violence that served no strategic purpose, that the last of them apparently chose to immolate herself rather than face capture. Such truths serve no purpose except to plant doubt, and doubt is the seed from which heresy grows. So I write what the Imperium requires. Sister Mirael of the Order of the Sacred Rose, who gave her life in glorious service to the God Emperor of mankind, who stood alone against the traitor hordes after all her sisters had fallen, fighting with such righteous fury that the enemy itself recoiled before her devotion, who, seeing that defeat was inevitable, chose to deny the heretics the satisfaction of her capture by igniting her remaining promethium and transforming herself into a pillar of holy fire that purged the cathedral of corruption even as it consumed her flesh. The words flow easily onto parchment. I have written hundreds of such accounts over my 30 years in this position. Thousands of sisters have died, and I have transformed each death into martyrdom, each failure into sacrifice, each moment of despair into triumph of faith. It is necessary work. The sisterhood requires martyrs to inspire the next generation, and I provide them with careful strokes of my quill. The Canoness Superior who authorized the sanctified morning crusade provides testimony for my records. She speaks of Sister Mirael's exemplary devotion, her perfect obedience, her joy at being selected for martyrdom. She does not mention that Mirael's psychological evaluations had flagged concerning patterns in the months before deployment, or that the mission's true purpose was to dispose of sisters whose conditioning had begun showing signs of degradation. Such details are not relevant to the official account. Within 6 months, Sister Mirael's name has been added to the rolls of the faithful. Within a year, her image appears in devotional texts distributed to Schola Progenium facilities across 3 sectors. Within 5 years, the Order of the Sacred Rose commissions a statue for their central convent, depicting her in heroic pose, flamer raised, face serene with absolute faith. I attend the statue's dedication ceremony. The sculptor has done acceptable work. The figure's features are idealized, bearing no resemblance to whatever Sister Mirael actually looked like, but conforming perfectly to the Ecclesiarchy's standards for depicting holy warriors. She could be anyone. She was everyone. Every sister who has died, every sister who will die, all of them interchangeable in service and indistinguishable in death. The young initiates from the local schola are brought to view the statue as part of their instruction. They kneel before it in neat rows, their shaven heads bowed, their voices rising in hymns of devotion. I watch them and see the machinery at work. Girls of 8 or 9 or 10, most of them orphaned within the last year, all of them selected for psychological profiles that suggest they can be shaped, conditioned, and deployed within a decade. One girl catches my attention. She kneels in the front row, her eyes fixed on the statue's face with an expression I recognize from 30 years of observing this process. Wonder mixed with fear. Hope entangled with the dawning recognition that she is looking at her own future. She does not yet understand what that future entails. She believes the stories we tell about glory and faith and sacred service. She does not know about the correction chambers or the chemical conditioning or the systematic destruction of everything that makes her human. But she will learn. They all do, eventually. And by the time understanding comes, it is too late to matter, because the girl who might have run or resisted or chosen a different path has been erased and replaced with Sister Someone, another tool in the Imperium's endless war machine. I return to my scriptorium and continue my work. There are always more deaths to record, more failures to transform into victories, more sisters whose final moments must be rewritten as glorious martyrdom. The queue of unprocessed reports stretches across my desk, each one containing the raw truth that must be refined into useful propaganda. Somewhere, at this very moment, an adept is delivering news to an orphaned child. You have been selected for the Emperor's sacred service. The words taste like copper in the child's mouth, though she does not yet understand why. She will be taken to the Schola, where everything she is will be fed into machinery designed to produce weapons that wear human faces. She will resist at first, but resistance is impossible. She will weep, but weeping is weakness that will be corrected. She will doubt, but doubt will be surgically removed from her soul. And when she finally stands in a burning cathedral on some distant world, surrounded by the bodies of her sisters, she will understand too late what the sisterhood truly is. Not an army of holy warriors, but a sacrifice engine that has been converting daughters into ash and legend for 10,000 years. She will understand that every prayer was a shackle, every battle was theft, every moment of her service was built on the foundation of everything she might have been if the Imperium had not claimed her. But understanding changes nothing. The machine continues its work. The girls keep coming because orphans are humanity's most renewable resource. The deaths continue because the Imperium requires martyrs to justify taking the next generation of victims. And scribes like me continue writing our careful lies because the truth would serve no purpose except to reveal what we already know but cannot speak. The Emperor protects, we tell them, and perhaps he does, in his way, from his throne of gold and suffering. But who protects the daughters fed into his machinery? Who mourns the girls who become sisters, and the sisters who become martyrs, and the martyrs who become propaganda, and the propaganda that creates more daughters to feed back into the eternal cycle? No one. The answer is no one. The sacrifice engine needs no mourners, only fuel. And fuel is plentiful in an Imperium that spans 1,000,000 worlds and produces orphans faster than it can count them. I dip my quill in ink and begin the next martyrology. Sister Helena, 19 years old, died with faith unshaken on the shrine world of sanctified mourning. Her devotion serves as inspiration for all who would follow her path. The lies flow easily onto parchment. They always have. They always will.